Hey guys, I hope you're all doing great on this fine afternoon. I hope you have all been enjoying my Donkey Kong December videos. I've had so much fun diving into each and every single one of these games. The community continues to grow, the views and likes and awesome comments continue to pour in, and I really couldn't be more thankful for the community that we are creating here. So thank you. I hope you guys continue to enjoy the content moving forward. Have a great and happy and safe new year moving into 2025, on to bigger and better things. For my final video of 2024, I wanted to talk about the game and more broadly the trilogy of games that more or less made me a video game fan and a Donkey Kong fan in general. So, let's get into it. When you say the words Donkey Kong Country, those words alone conjure up a lot of memories for me of sitting in my grandma and grandpa's basement. Obviously, I've told this story before, playing on their blue Game Boy Advance SP, obviously the better version of the Game Boy Advance, playing the original Donkey Kong Country on the Game Boy Advance SP. I still own that cartridge to this day, but the memories of the platforming and the bananas scattered across the jungles and some of the most gorgeous 16-bit visuals to ever grace a console. The trilogy on the Super Nintendo is obviously legendary. It's a near-perfect blend of gameplay, visuals, music, ambience, and just an all-around great gameplay experience. But then, a decade later, the trilogy was re-released on the Game Boy Advance, a move that initially stirred up plenty of debate among fans. Were these ports at all worthy successors of the originals, or were they just mere shadows of their Super Nintendo counterparts trying to capitalize off of the name recognition? Well, let's talk about it. First, I wanted to set the stage. The Super Nintendo versions of DKC, DKC2, and DKC3 were obviously technical masterpieces in the 90s. Rare's use of silicon graphics technology created a pre-rendered 3D look that absolutely stunned players. But by the early 2000s, gaming had moved on for the most part. The GameCube was out, Mario Kart Double Dash was blowing by all expectations, and handheld gaming had kind of taken on a life of its own, thanks to obviously the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance was powerful for its time, sure, but it was definitely no Super Nintendo. The screen was smaller, the resolution was much lower, and the audio capabilities, let's just say, they left something to be desired. So, the Game Boy Advance versions of the Donkey Kong Country games were never going to be pitch-perfect ports. They had to do some reimagining for the hardware, and while some changes were divisive, sure, others, in my opinion, really elevated the experience in ways that the originals didn't, or couldn't. Let's start with the most obvious difference and one of the biggest negatives that people throw at these ports: the graphics. The Super Nintendo games to this day are still stunning. The colors, the backgrounds, the smooth animations, they feel almost magical even today. But the Game Boy Advance versions, on the other hand, had to make compromises. Because of the Game Boy Advance's dim, unlit screen, the developers had to brighten the entire color palette across all three games. This change was functional. It made the games easier to see on the hardware, but it also gave them a pretty washed out look compared to the Super Nintendo games. The backgrounds lost some of their detail, and character sprites didn't quite pop as much as they did on the original games. However, it wasn't all bad. The Game Boy Advance versions introduced new animations for certain characters and objects, adding a bit of flair to scenes that otherwise felt static on the Super Nintendo. For example, bosses like King K. Rool now had more expressive, exaggerated movements, making battles feel a bit more dynamic. So while the overall visuals might have taken a step back, the added touches brought a new layer of personality to this trilogy. Now this is where things start to get heated. The music of Donkey Kong Country on the Super Nintendo is iconic. Obviously, I've talked about it ad nauseum at this point. David Wise and Evelyn Fisher created soundtracks that they created soundtracks that were atmospheric to the highest degree. Aquatic Ambience, Stickerbush Symphony are legendary for a reason. The Game Boy Advance, unfortunately, could not replicate that, at least not to its full potential. The handheld's audio hardware was vastly inferior, and the soundtracks had to be reworked entirely. The result? Well, I don't mind it, but it also very much depends on who you ask. Some fans argue that the Game Boy Advance soundtracks lack the richness and depth of the originals, while others appreciate the fresh take. David Wise himself returned to recompose a lot of the music for this Game Boy Advance port trilogy. And while the results are definitely different, they're not without their merit. The Game Boy Advance soundtracks have a more upbeat, energetic vibe that fits the handheld's pick-up-and-play nature. It's not better and it's not worse, it's just different. It's a different take. Now here is where the Game Boy Advance versions really start to shine to me. The core gameplay of the trilogy remained intact. Tight platforming, hidden secrets, and those memorable animal buddies were all present. But the Game Boy Advance versions also introduced several quality of life improvements that made them more accessible to modern players. Remember, these games came out 10 years after the original. For one, the save system was overhauled. On the Super Nintendo, saving often required collecting coins or reaching specific points in the game, but on the Game Boy Advance version, saving is much more frequent and straightforward, reducing a lot of frustration for newcomers as gaming gets more and more accessible and mainstream. Additionally, the Game Boy Advance versions also added new collectibles and minigames. The minigames I remember because I played these games first. I played the Game Boy Advance trilogy first, and when I went back and I played them on the Super Nintendo and I realized that all of the minigames were missing, I was shocked. I never would have thought that a quote-unquote inferior port would feature minigames and the originals wouldn't. I remember being so shocked by that. And the minigames didn't just feel tacked on to me either, they felt integrated into the experience. For example, DonkeyKongCountry 2 on the Game Boy Advance introduced the DK Theater, where players could view cutscenes and unlockable content. And on Donkey Kong Country 3, they included a new world, Pacifica, with additional levels that expanded the game's scope. It's these things that really make these ports of these games stand out. They are ports, sure, but there's just so much more here, and they don't get the credit that they deserve, not at all. Another standout feature of the Game Boy Advance versions was their multiplayer modes. Using a Game Boy Advance's link cable, players could compete in new minigames or even race through levels. And while these modes weren't groundbreaking by any stretch, it was cool that they were added at all, and they added a social element that the Super Nintendo games just lacked entirely. And beyond the multiplayer, the Game Boy Advance ports included new cutscenes and dialogue, and while I've made videos talking about how I love the dialogue-less storytelling, the visual storytelling of these games, it is refreshing to get a different take, a more streamlined take with dialogue and a bit more story and things like that. I don't prefer one version over the other, I'm just glad they kind of chose to do their own thing. It gives the games a lot more personality, and characters like Cranky Kong and Funky Kong had expanded roles too, adding humor while also adding charm to the overall experience. So, real quick, to me, this is what the Game Boy Advance versions did better than the Super Nintendo versions. The expanded content is number one. The new levels, the new minigames, the unlockables, it gave the games a lot more replay value than just going back and playing them on the Super Nintendo. Number two I have written down is the quality of life improvements, the streamlined saving, the gameplay tweaks that made the trilogy a bit more accessible, more streamlined, and just feel a bit better. The new expressive animations added details that bring new life to characters and the bosses. And my fourth thing is the multiplayer modes. The link cable functionality provided a pretty significant social dimension that the Super Nintendo just didn't have. It lacked it entirely. But to me, like I said, again, this is all subjective, I'm not forcing anyone to agree with me, the most significant improvement was how the Game Boy Advance versions made the Donkey Kong Country trilogy portable. For fans who grew up with the Super Nintendo, being able to revisit these classics on the go and have them look and feel and sound as good as they did was magical. And for a new generation of players, like myself, the Game Boy Advance ports served as a gateway to one of gaming's most beloved series. This, the first game in particular on the Game Boy Advance SP, is the reason that I am a video game fan to this day. And so, at the end of the day, comparing the Super Nintendo and Game Boy Advance versions of the Donkey Kong Country trilogy isn't about declaring a, quote, winner. It's about appreciating each version and how they reflect the era in which it was created. The Super Nintendo originals are timeless masterpieces. They're my favorite games ever. They push the boundaries of what was possible in the 90s. And the Game Boy Advance ports, while not perfect at all, they brought these masterpieces to a new audience and added their own unique twists too. So, whether you're a purist who swears by the Super Nintendo or someone who cherishes their memories of playing Donkey Kong Country on a blue Game Boy Advance SP like myself during long car rides or in your grandma and grandpa's basement, there is no wrong way to appreciate this trilogy. Both versions have their strengths, and together, they ensure that Donkey Kong Country remains a treasure for generations to come. I'll see you guys in the next video. I hope you had a great Donkey Kong December. Have a great day, and take care.